Hello, creatives. Welcome to True Creativity Within the podcast. I hope wherever you are in the world that you're staying cool, comfortable, and if you're like me, ready for a new season. I usually get like this towards the end now that we're in the end of August. I am now looking forward to autumn and the change of the season. I usually get like this towards the end of the summer where I'm just kind of done with it. Unfortunately, here in California, summer kind of drags out almost sometimes through October. So I'm just hoping that it comes sooner than later. Anyway, I hope that you're ready for a new season also, and welcoming whatever the next few months has to offer in the remaining part of this year. I cannot believe how fast this year has gone by. And actually, I'm not really surprised because that's kind of how it's been lately in my life. It's like so much going on that I have to actually slow down and remember to try to be grateful and appreciate what's happening in the moment, so that time doesn't go by so fast. So anyway, welcome. Today I'm going to talk about creative spirit. This is a term that I have been using more frequently lately when I'm teaching, but it's a term that I adopted a couple of years ago. This is not a new term. But it is something that I find myself using more frequently because it best describes what I'm going to go over with you in this podcast. Because creative spirit can mean different things to different people. And I thought I would just kind of break it down, like the different variations of what creative spirit could represent. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about my own experience with it and why I think of it as something that actually is the motivator behind a creative expression and the motivator behind our creative process. So I wanted this episode to be dedicated to defining creative spirit. Now, before I jump into that, I do want to say that whatever I share on this podcast are just thoughts that I put together. I kind of connect the dots. Sometimes it makes perfect sense to me and I get excited and I want to share it with you guys. But I know that not everything I say will resonate with everyone. So I want to encourage you to just kind of pick and choose what works for you, what seems to fit for you, what resonates for you. And if it doesn't, that's perfectly fine. I'm the same way in terms of when I'm learning new things. I kind of cherry pick what really resonates for me, and then there's some things that don't. And it doesn't mean that you just completely reject it 100%. I do a cherry picking in terms of what I can adopt for me personally, especially when it comes to my creativity. So I just wanted to put that out there. So to encourage you to just be discerning. And like I said in my last episode, be discerning and selective on what you adopt for yourself and who you listen to, right? So, okay, so let's get started. Creative spirit. So creative spirit can represent different things for different people. And one of the things that is most common is that, well, there's two things that are common. The first one I'm thinking of is we often refer to someone who is a creative spirit, right? Who has a creative spirit. It's like a characteristic that is in a person who seems creative, artistic, lives a creative life, and we refer to that person as he or she or they are such a creative spirit or has a creative spirit. So it becomes like a description for somebody. And, there's there's people that I know who maybe aren't even professional artists or writers or any creative profession, but they just gravitate to creativity. their friends are creative. The experiences that they have are creative oriented. The way they dress, the way that their environment or their maybe their home, it's got a touch of that creativity. I've known a few people like that, but they don't do anything that's actually a creative profession or artistic. So that's a really good example of a creative spirit. Another thing a creative spirit could be is inspiration. This is one of the most common things that we've heard for centuries from different artists. Creative inspiration could be something that was divinely inspired, right? It came from the divine. It was a spark of an idea. It was a muse. We've heard and read many novels, books, even artists sharing that they found their muse that was the inspiration for their artwork or their novel or their poem, or for their song. They talk about their muse. And I'm thinking of that one movie, if you've not seen it, The Girl with the Pearl Earring. That one is a really good example of he was looking for a muse to inspire his paintings. So I'm thinking about that off the cuff. Creative inspiration could be like a lot of spiritual gurus talk about getting a download from the heavens. So it was creative spirit could be creative inspiration that has often been used throughout the centuries as something that came from the heavens, that's something that was inspiring to the artist, other than themselves, right? So that's probably one of the most common thing when you think of creative spirit, you think of creative inspiration. Another thing I think of as creative spirit is I think of it as something that we are inherently born with because we're human. So creativity, or the inkling to create and be creative and to problem solve and to invent, is something that I believe, and this is not new, this is not a new concept, that I believe every human being is born with, because it's very much a part of being human. Now, I know a lot of people will say I'm not creative, but I always love to question that, because I believe everybody's got some kind of creativity that they came into this world with. And it may not necessarily be artistic. It can be something else that inspires them to create something, inspires them to problem solve. Before, I never thought of programmers as being creative, as a creative profession, as creative individuals. And then I realized that programming is actually a creative process. But sometimes we think of that as it's tech, right? It's numbers, it's formulas put together. We don't think of it as artistic, but that is a creative process. It's creative. So sometimes, if you're one of those people that says, I'm not creative, right? I would really examine that and see what in your life is possibly a creative process for you. So I believe creative spirit is something that we're born with. Because let's take a look at ancient artists. Now, ancient artists is, early humans. This is before, I'm talking before, the Sistine Chapel, before Leonardo da Vinci. I'm talking early humans were already doing artistic expression. Now, ancient artists, now let me go back for a minute, because if creativity is part of being human, remember, it was a necessity to invent tools, to hunt, to look for food, to look for shelter, right? It was necessary to create clothing, to migrate during different seasons, to migrate when food source was lacking. So I believe that's why, part of why creative spirit is already in our DNA. But when we look at ancient artists, early human beings were using creative expression to process life. So a lot of times, when you go back and you look at some of these archaeological discoveries, you will find a ritual that they did to process death, a ritual that they did to welcome the changes of the seasons, right? Stonehenge and places like that were really used for, partly used for seasons, for the changes of the planets and the sun and the stars and all that. But that required creative spirit. So I also believe that creative spirit was a way to help humans make sense of the world. We take it for granted. We have so much information now that we can learn anything about anything, everything about anything on the internet. But back then, they weren't sure what was going on. So if there was an eclipse, they had to make sense of that. So they made sense of that in their own way. And they maybe created a ritual around that, or maybe they said the gods are doing this, or this was representation of this. It's like they created symbology around it. They even created their own language around that stuff. So I believe creative spirit was also a way to make sense of the world, to make sense of things that we didn't understand. And I believe also creative spirit is still part in this day and age to help us make sense. And that's why I believe creativity, and when you're creating, you are tapping into some source to help make sense of some things. I'm going to talk a little bit about that because that's when I think of creativity as a form of healing, because it can be cathartic. Art journaling, writing poetry, writers who are trying to make sense of their own struggles and confusion and life's journey, or their own trauma, trying to make sense of it in a novel or a script or a movie. I believe creativity and creative expression becomes an avenue to heal, to make sense of what went on. And this is not new, right? We know that this has been adopted. This is why we have art therapy, right? Art therapy is a form of therapy, but utilizing art. So creative spirit can be cathartic. And another thing too, I know in my experience, when I'm immersed in the creative process, my mind becomes more quiet, right? It becomes more mindful, because the creative process can be mindful. It's like a mindful meditation. Things become still, my mind becomes quiet. And in that moment is when sometimes some of my ideas start popping up. And specifically when I'm doing art that isn't really requiring a lot of thinking and problem solving, but I'm just kind of in the moment. I'm in the process, I'm in the flow, and I'm lost. I believe that's when, you tap into some inner guidance, because I believe that, through our own life experiences, our own development, we are almost like gathering all this information outside of us, from our experiences, from our conversations with people, that we start to hold all this insight within us. But sometimes we don't know that. We don't know that we have actually the answers to our own problems, or the insight to our own need for wisdom, our own wisdom, actually. So I believe that sometimes during the creative process, that inner wisdom can surface. It can begin to show light to things about what we're struggling with in the moment, what we're unclear of, what we're confused with. It can help us with moments of uncertainty. So in the creative process, we're tapping into that inner wisdom and inner guidance. So I believe that alone can be considered creative spirit. Here's a quote I want to share with you by Betsy Beckman. Art making is somehow all at once a journey, a communication, a modality, a healing, and a prayer. Art is a distinctly, though perhaps not exclusively, human activity. Through the arts, we connect with the mystery of the creative spirit beyond us, moving in us and through us. Through the arts, we open ourselves to dialogue with the divine. And then there's creative spirit as a higher power, something beyond ourselves, something beyond the technique, our art education, our artistic experience, something bigger than ourselves. And this is something that has been really interesting to me because in my own experience, I realize, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, I realize that when I get out of my way and I stop trying to control, problem solve, overthink, figure it out, when I let go of that need to do that in the midst of the creative process, something else begins to flow. And I think this is part of creative flow, and why a lot of people feel like when they're in creative flow, something else is creating. It's not them. And that's kind of has been my own experience, is that I remember specifically one day in my studio, I was prepping up for a show, so I had multiple pieces going on. I could feel myself just like in the doing mode. I need to get this done. I need to get, for many of you who have prepared for an art show, there are a lot of steps to preparing an artwork to be 100% complete and then ready for hanging, right? Even though it can be close to being done, there's a lot of steps. So anyway, so I was a little bit overwhelmed with that, and I felt like I had a lot of pieces not done, but I was working on a piece, and I found myself struggling, and it was just like all of a sudden I got stuck. I don't know what I'm doing. Whatever I'm doing isn't working, and I've become more and more and increasingly frustrated. And then now I'm like trying to, get some willpower in there and trying to force it to work. Okay, let me do this, let me do that. And the more I forced it, the worse it got. And it was like everything I did, any technique or application on that piece just was making the piece look more and more awful. And then more and more I got frustrated. So I got so frustrated that I found myself suddenly like, I'm just giving up. I'm done. I'm going to stop trying. And instead I surrendered to being in the present moment. In other words, stop trying to figure it out. Stop trying to overthink it, problem solve it. Instead, I just became more present with the process. So what happened is I started to let go of control. I started leaning more into the uncertainty of where this piece was going to end up or how it was going to look. I let go of the expectation of, well, it was supposed to look this way because I had envisioned it this way. I let go of that. Okay, letting go of my original vision. And I completely surrendered to the present moment. And what I noticed, what happened, is that I was still moving. I was still like, okay, I'm going to add this color. I'm going to put this piece of collage on there. I'm going to, paint over this. I was still going through the motions, but I didn't have the expectation. In other words, I was kind of moving the ego out. The thing with ego is that ego wants to figure it out. It wants 1 + 1 = 2. It wants to know what's the next move. It wants you to pre-plan, pre-map it out, and tell me what it's supposed to look like. So sometimes the ego gets in the way of the creative spirit or process. So I was letting go of the ego, letting go of the overthinking and the controlling. And then something happened that was unusual. I felt like, as I was going through the motions, things were starting to fall into place naturally. Things suddenly were working. Things all of a sudden, and I wasn't saying, okay, I'm going to do that because I'm going to get this result. I'm just going to do that. So I hope you understand the difference. And in that moment, the piece began to evolve on its own into something that I didn't expect. The piece started to evolve and take shape into something that was beyond what I had originally envisioned. And in that moment, as I was feeling like I was no longer in control, no longer trying to pre-plan everything, something else felt like it was dictating the process in that moment. And that's when I feel and believe creative spirit kicked in. And what I know from my experience is that creative spirit seems to know better than I do. Because creative spirit, and this can be applied to anything, creative spirit has a bigger vision for what you are supposed to create, what you are meant to do in this world, in your life. Creative spirit seems to know the bigger picture. Now, you can say creative spirit is the universe, and your universe, God, creative spirit, seems to know and understand and see the bigger picture when we have limited vision, limited perspective. So I'm pertaining to creative spirit in the creative process as I share with you my experience. Because every time that has happened, the piece never ends up the way I originally thought it was going to. Because sometimes what happens is I have this idea, I'm trying to execute it, it's not working, and then I get frustrated because I'm so stuck and attached to the original vision of what I had in mind. And I know now that I gotta let that go because creative spirit has a bigger plan. And I have always been taken back and surprised by what ends up happening on the piece. It's like, that's why also I always say, let's welcome accidents and mistakes, because when we welcome accidents and mistakes versus preventing those to happen, it's the accidents and the mistakes and the unexpected and the uncertainty, the things that we didn't plan, the things that we couldn't have planned, begin to blossom. And that's when I believe creative magic happens, is when we get out of the way. When we get out of the way of the creative process, creative spirit can now show us what can happen to our creations, to the possibility. Because sometimes we can't see the possibilities, right? Creative spirit wants to say, hey, go here, follow this. So that was my experience, and it's really interesting, because it's like, okay, now I know what those artists have been talking about all these centuries, about the muse, about some higher power that comes down and begins to write that poem, that novel, makes that piece of art. So I hope that inspires you, because I think that's really important to think about. And the reason why I wanted to talk about creative spirit too is just a reminder. If you're an artist, a creative professional, yes, it's important to hone in your craft, master your skills, learn your skills, and really learn how to work that creative process in order to complete the project. That is an important skill to have. But it's not just that. Creativity, true creativity, is not just about a finished product. It is not just about a physical product that you stick on the wall, or you submit to a literary agency, or pitched for a movie, or it's not just that. That is a big part of it. But remember, it is so much more than that. It is so much more than that. And if you can tap into creative spirit, I believe that's when you might just surprise yourself. You might just be surprised by what you can actually create if you were to just get out of the way. So that is something that I wanted to share with you. Creative spirit there's so much more that can come from it. I also believe that creative spirit calls to us, especially if you feel like you're one of those people who have been afraid to do anything creative, but you feel this pull. That's creative spirit calling you to honor your creativity, to honor that deep desire to do something creative. Because I understand, and I'll probably talk about this repeatedly, I understand how scary it can be to pursue that creative part of you if you feel like you're afraid you're not going to be good enough, or you're afraid you're not artistic or creative, and that keeps you from doing the thing that you love. If you are at that place, I call it a closet artist, right? I would encourage you and give yourself permission to pursue that creative inclination, that desire to do something creative, even if it's the simplest thing as doodling, right? As collaging, as writing a haiku. It could be as simple as, taking your phone and creating interesting videos, or taking photographs of flowers or sunsets or whatever. There is no limit to what is considered artistic or creative. But the main thing is that you are doing it because you are curious about it. You love it. Something about it sparks that creative inspiration. There's something about that thing. And this could be cooking, decorating birthday cakes, right? Anything that is igniting your creative spirit, your own creative spirit, go for it. I really want to encourage people, don't be intimidated. Like, you want to do something creative, and then you go and you take an art class, and then you go there and you feel so intimidated that you give up. Do something that's simple. Do something and there's so much online now, so much that you can do. I think that's one of the reasons why coloring books a few years ago became so, not a few years ago, quite a bit now, I think I want to say 10 years ago, coloring books became such a trendy thing for adults because it was the easiest and simplest way to be creative. So whatever that thing is for you, please pursue that, explore it, give yourself permission to try it. And also don't be intimidated so easily, because It's tough to find some class out there that you can take that is non-traditional. I think traditional art classes can be a little intimidating, and I'm all about go someplace where you can play first, where you can actually just dive in and do something creative or artistic that doesn't require you to know how to draw or paint, but that you just know how to glue on pieces of paper. So anyway, creative spirit, think about it. Think about what is creative spirit in your life, and what is creative spirit within you. Just think about that, and I hope that this podcast gave you a little bit of something to think about and contemplate about, because it's important that you find that creative spirit within you and kind of nourish it and nurture it, and honor it and bring it to life so that it's not stuck in the closet or stuck for when you retire or whatever. So anyway, thank you for listening. I appreciate all of you who have subscribed to my YouTube channel, who are following my podcast. Thank you for listening, and thank you for your time. I hope that this gives you inspiration and the courage and support to pursue your natural artistic creative spirit. I got one more thing I want to share with you. Did you know that connecting to creative spirit is a form of self-care? I truly believe doing something creative where you get lost in the creative process is just as essential as exercising, eating right, and getting enough rest. And why is that? Because when you're doing something creative, it's a form of mindfulness meditation, a way to de-stress, and it can calm your nervous system down. So, maybe think about starting an art practice. If you're interested in starting one, I have 2 online courses perfect for that. My mixed media minis, which I also call M&Ms, and my art journaling for beginners. So I hope that you will go to truecreativitywithin.com and check that out. Those 2 courses are waiting for you to start. Stay creative.